All of my content is also posted on 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all of your Magic the Gathering needs, including articles, podcasts, and custom Magic the Gathering tokens and playmats. As a subscriber to my channel, you can use the discount code NEETSAHONE5 for a 5% discount in their store. You can find the link in the description below. Hello everyone and welcome to another MTG Top 10. I'm NEETSAHONE and I post a new Magic-related Top 10 list each and every Friday. This video is the second in a three-part series of Halloween-inspired Magic the Gathering Top 10s. Last week we looked at the top 10 vampires, and this week we're going to look at the top 10 spiders in Magic's history. Next week I will conclude with the final Halloween-themed list. Spiders seem like an especially good topic because it not only relates to Halloween, a holiday that often involves decorations involving spiders and their webs, but also because there is a spider tearing up Standard right now that will in fact be on this list. The spiders on this list are arranged in order of the number of premier event top 8s they achieved. Spiders are not quite as successful as vampires were last week, in part because there have been so few of them printed, only 45 in the history of Magic, which kind of surprised me because it seems like there's a spider in basically every draft format, but I guess there's usually only one and many of them are reprints. And there are only actually 8 in the history of Magic to finish in the top 8 of at least one Grand Prix or Pro Tour, but that is sort of flavorful in a way that an 8-legged creature has 8 spiders in the top 8 in top 8s in the history of Grand Prix and Pro Tours. So the number 10 and number 9 slot on this list are going to be a little more subjective and based in large part just in my opinion about the card, though I will do my best to support their position on the list. Just a quick reminder on how the scoring system works here on determining this top 10. Each card is in its place on its list based on its score. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour top 8s they've received, with the Pro Tour top 8 being worth twice as much as a Grand Prix top 8. Now, let's get started with number 10. As I mentioned, number 9 and 10 on the list did not actually receive any top 8s, and as a result are based mostly on my own judgment. For number 10, I chose Spider Spawning, mostly because it was an incredibly viable and incredibly fun draft archetype in the original Innistrad draft format. There were no shortage of ways to mill yourself in the format, and if you picked up a couple of Spider Spawnings early, it wasn't hard to build around and make an insane and fun limited deck that had a great shot at finishing highly in your pod. Spider Spawning was great because, while you preferred to draw it, you didn't lose your combo if you milled it because it had flashback. People won a lot of games on the backs of spider tokens in that format, and as a result, I think it deserves to be mentioned in any list about the best spiders in Magic's history. At number 9, we have our last card to never make an appearance in a Pro Tour or Grand Prix top 8, and that is Nyx Weaver. This thing would actually combo pretty well with Spider Spawning because it mills you at the beginning of your upkeep for free and can eventually return a card from your graveyard to your hand, while bringing it to the table a reasonable 2-3 body, and the keyword that almost every spider has, although one on this list does not, and that is Reach. While it didn't crack in the top 8 of Premier events, it did have some success in the Standard of its day, making the top 8 in Star City Game Opens and doing well on Magic Online and in Pro Tour qualifiers and so on. The deck it saw the most play in was the Black-Green Constellation deck, a deck which sought to play a bunch of enchantments, which Nyx Weaver is. It's both a creature and an enchantment. And the idea was you had a lot of cards in your deck that said Constellation, and that means triggers occurred when you played an enchantment. And so Nyx Weaver would be a creature who could trigger these Constellation triggers while also getting you back powerful cards from your graveyard. Alright, from here on we have 8 cards that made at least one Pro Tour Grand Prix top 8, so let's move on to number 8. At number 8 we have Stinger Fling Spider. Most spiders are pretty good against flyers, right? Well, Stinger Fling Spider takes it to a new level. Not only does he have reach like most spiders do, he also has a pretty powerful enter the battlefield ability. He can destroy any creature with flying. Now, you have to be sure your opponent has targets for this thing to be playable and constructed, or you can just run a toolbox deck with one of the more powerful and more broken tutors of all time in it, and that is Birthing Pod. Many versions of the deck ran Stinger Fling Spider at least in the sideboard to bring in against opponents who ran flyers. The great thing about the pod is that you really only have to have one of a card in your deck, in this case Stinger Fling Spider, and you can still find a way to get it into play whenever it is you need it. While only one deck running Stinger Fling Spider in its sideboard made a top 8, it was a common sideboard card for the deck. Unfortunately, with Pod banned in Modern, and honestly with there being more useful cards to tutor for anyway, this spider will likely never improve his resume. Kind of like Stinger Fling Spider, this card looks like it wouldn't have a hope to see play anywhere other than maybe EDH, where its land cycling ability can be useful because it can help you fix your mana. But there is a deck in Modern that loves fat creatures who can be cycled, and that is Living End. The Living End deck runs cards with Cascade and tries to cast Living End for free after pitching a bunch of cards that cycle, like Pale Recluse, and then brings them back onto the battlefield while destroying all of the creatures your opponent has in play. It is a pretty powerful strategy, and one that sees play in Modern even now. However, the Recluse is not a card that regularly shows up in the deck, though there is another Spider who does, which we will talk about later, and as such it has only ever managed one Premier Event top 8. It has gotten close in several other tournaments to making the top 8, but these days, living in players shun this poor Spider. Things could shift, and maybe people will decide to play the Recluse again in future versions of Living In, but probably not, since cards that have actual cycling instead of land cycling are better in the deck than land cycling is, because if you're actually cycling, you can dig for your card with Cascade, or you can dig for, more things to cycle, and Pale Recluse doesn't really let you continue that chain. It just gets you a land. So, at number 6, we have Penumbra Spider. 4 mana with a 2/4 for a 2/4 with reach isn't a great deal, but the fact that this guy replaces himself makes him into a 2-for-1. As a result, he was a pretty powerful common in Time Spiral Draft. He even appeared in 3 top 8 decks at the Pro Tour whose main format was Triple Time Spiral Draft. However, for the purposes of our list, we generally focus on Constructed for the most part, though having an impressive limited record does help us edge out Pale Recluse, who also only had a score of 1. The Spider showed up in Constructed in a Time Spiral block deck at Grand Prix Montreal in 2007. It was in the sideboard for the same reason that Spiders usually are in sideboards, to combat flyers. At number 5, we have a card that looks pretty terrible to us today, and that is Woolly Spider. 3 mana for a 2/3 with reach that gets more toughness when it blocks flyers by today's standards. It is basically a borderline playable card in Limited. But 20 years ago, back in 1996, which it's crazy that was 20 years ago, this card was in a deck that won a Pro Tour. Not just top 8'd, but won a Pro Tour. Why was it worth running? Well, because the format was loaded with decks running Pyroclasm, and this Spider could survive that. What's more, it also could block common win conditions of the day, including cards like Blinking Spirit and Ivory Gargoyle. And it could block them and survive, most importantly. And those were the win conditions in the deck that this deck beat in the finals of the Pro Tour back in 1996. And this Spider is not afraid of really any creature with flying who was played in that format. So it's sort of better in the meta game than it looks like us today, because today it doesn't look so good. At number 4, we have a card that was actually a running mate of Woolly Spider. That's right, a deck that won a Pro Tour in 1996 was running 2 Spiders, and it ran 4 copies of each. This one, while still not amazing to us today, actually seems to be a little bit better. It is the only Spider printed that doesn't have reach, which is a little bit weird and a fun fact, but it does actually make some sense flavor-wise, since Trapdoor Spiders in the real world don't generally spin webs. Instead, they hide underneath things and attack anything that comes near them, hence their nickname, Trapdoor Spider. This guy is also a 2/3 for 3, meaning he can survive Pyroclasm, but he can also act as removal in a pinch, though once again it can only target non-flying creatures, which again is actually pretty flavorful. It is worth noting, by the way, that Frank Karsten, in an article for Channel Fireball written several years ago, named the deck that ran 4 copies of this Spider and of Woolly Spider as the worst deck ever to win a Pro Tour, so that's a little sad for our Spiders, but they won a Pro Tour nonetheless. At number 3, we have another card with an old frame, and that is Silklash Spider. This one isn't quite as old as the others, and as a result is considerably more powerful creature. While 2/7 body with reach for 5 mana isn't a great rate, but it's not terrible either, what really gave it value, though, was the ability to kill tons of flyers all at once. It existed in a format where Exalted Angel, Chroma Angel of Wrath, and Windborne Muse were commonly played, and it could block all of them effectively, and even kill them if you ever got to enough mana. As a result, Darwin Castle chose to run a full 4 copies of this card in his sideboard at Pro Tour Venice in 2003 on his way to a top 8. Alright, so far, we haven't had a Spider that got more than 1 Premier Event top 8, which is pretty sad for a top 8 list, but luckily, the top 2 Spider on this list have some fairly impressive resumes. At number 2, we have another Spider with cycling, and as a result of that cycling, it also sees play in the Living Index we mentioned before. However, it has had more success in the deck and appears more regularly in it for reasons mentioned earlier. Cycling is just better than land cycling in a deck that is trying to draw into a card with Cascade or into another card with cycling. This Spider was in the original Living In deck, built and piloted by Travis Wu, and has been consistently in the deck ever since. This Spider will continue to build its resume too. It had its most recent Grand Prix top 8 just a few months ago, and Living In is still a very relevant deck in Modern. Now we move on to number 1, a card most of you have probably assumed was number 1 from the very beginning, and is also the first Spider in 20 years to top 8 a Pro Tour. And that is Ishka Graph Widow. She may be the newest Spider on this list, but she can already claim the title of the best Spider in the history of Magic. She's incredibly good, especially in decks that can easily get Delirium, and that's not something that is very hard to achieve in Standard right now. Basically, any mid-range or control deck with green in it is running Ishka right now, and that is because she provides so much value for only 5 mana. Some decks even run her without being able to pay for her 6 and a black ability, and instead just run her for the sheer value she brings. She can be a win condition of sorts, but she is more frequently a roadblock to put down until you can cast your Emrakul, since she comes with 3 bodies and a 3/5 body herself, and they all have reach, of course, as most spiders do, and that is not an easy thing to get through for an aggro deck. Basically, if you're an aggro deck and you're trying to get through an Ishka Graph Widow, if you let the game get to turn 5, you're going to have a pretty difficult time winning the game. While Ishka didn't manage to make any top 8 appearances at the most recent Pro Tour Kaladesh, Delirium decks and T-Merge decks running her were still around, and it is likely that she will continue to improve her resume. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. Spiders are probably the most underpowered tribe I have ever done in the history of this, of MTG Top 10. Wizards needs to print some more good ones, though I guess we just got Ishka, so maybe I'm being a little bit greedy. If you found this video useful or entertaining, don't forget to click the like button. If you have any comments about spiders that should have made this list or suggestions for future MTG Top 10s, let me know in the comments. And if you want to make sure you catch an MTG Top 10 each and every week, don't forget to subscribe. I'll be back next week with the third and final Halloween-themed MTG Top 10. Have a great weekend, everyone, and thanks for